What happens when one of Britain's most dignified actors explodes on live television? It only took 21 seconds for Colin Firth to go from composed gentleman to furiously walking off the Graham Norton Show after a confrontation that left the studio audience in complete shock. Before we dive into this incredible meltdown, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals and the most explosive moments caught on camera. Last night's taping of The Graham Norton Show was meant to be a light-hearted evening of celebrity banter and amusing anecdotes. Colin Firth arrived at the BBC studios in Television Centre looking impeccable in a perfectly tailored navy suit, ready to join the famous red couch alongside other guests for what should have been an entertaining hour of conversation and laughs. The atmosphere backstage was relaxed and jovial as always, with production staff bustling about, makeup artists doing final touch-ups, and the distinctive energy that comes from a live studio audience buzzing with anticipation. Graham Norton himself was in characteristically high spirits, armed with his signature wit, a glass of wine on his desk as always, and pages of amusing anecdotes and questions prepared to guide another evening of delightful celebrity chat. The show began exactly as it always does, with Graham's warm welcome and that familiar theme music that British audiences know so well. He welcomed his guests one by one with his trademark enthusiasm. Colin was introduced to thunderous applause and cheers, taking his seat on the iconic red sofa with his characteristic grace and modest smile, waving politely to the audience. The other guests that evening included a popular British comedian known for his sharp wit and a rising music star fresh off a #1 album, all settling in for what everyone in the studio expected to be a fun, casual conversation filled with the kind of amusing stories, gentle ribbing, and spontaneous moments that the Graham Norton Show has become internationally famous for. Graham started the conversation warmly and genuinely, as he always does with established stars, asking Colin about his recent projects and complimenting his enduring career with obvious sincerity. "Colin, you've been gracing our screens for decades now, always with such elegance and depth," Graham said with genuine admiration shining in his voice and expression. "You never seem to give a bad performance. How do you manage to stay so consistently brilliant while so many actors plateau or fade or disappear entirely?" Colin smiled modestly, shifting slightly in his seat and adjusting his jacket, clearly comfortable, but also slightly humble in that very British way. "Well, Graham, I think it's really about choosing projects that genuinely interest you rather than just taking everything that comes your way, working with talented people who challenge you and make you better, and never taking any of it for granted. I've been very fortunate, genuinely fortunate, to work with incredible directors and writers throughout my career. People who've pushed me and helped me grow." The audience applauded warmly and enthusiastically. Several people in the front rows were nodding in appreciation. Graham nodded along, taking a casual sip from his wine glass. "Yes, you certainly have indeed. And speaking of projects and your career choices, I wanted to ask you about something quite interesting you mentioned in a recent magazine interview. You said that you felt modern British cinema has become too obsessed with gritty realism and has lost some of its romantic charm and elegance. That's quite a bold statement, isn't it? Quite critical of the current state of things." Colin's expression became noticeably more thoughtful and serious, his posture straightening slightly as he prepared to engage with a more substantive topic. "I wouldn't necessarily call it bold, Graham. I think it's just an honest observation about current trends in the industry. British film used to have this wonderful, distinctive balance between substance and romanticism, between dealing with real social issues while still maintaining a certain elegance and sense of hope for the audience. That seems to have shifted somewhat in recent years toward unrelenting grimness." Graham leaned forward with visible interest, his interviewer instincts clearly fully engaged now, sensing an opportunity for a more interesting conversation than just promotional chat. But Colin, and forgive me for pushing back here because I find this genuinely interesting, haven't you yourself appeared in several of these gritty, realistic British films you're criticizing? Your role in that crime drama 2 years ago, for instance, was quite dark and brutal and bleak. Doesn't that make your criticism of the trend a bit contradictory? A bit hypocritical, even? The question hung in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. Colin's jaw tightened almost. Imperceptibly, a subtle shift that the close-up cameras caught immediately and zoomed in on. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Though his voice remained controlled and measured, there was a new edge to it. I don't think so, Graham. I really don't. Playing a complex character in a serious, well-written drama is very different from what I'm talking about. I'm discussing a broader trend in the industry as a whole, not criticizing individual projects or specific performances. There's a distinction there. Graham pressed on, his tone still superficially light, but now carrying an unmistakable edge of challenge that made the other guests visibly uncomfortable. Right, I understand that. But you are part of that trend, aren't you? You've consciously taken these darker roles in recent years. You've deliberately moved away from the romantic leads you were known for, the Mr. Darcy types. Some people might say you're actively contributing to the very thing you're now publicly lamenting, criticizing. How do you square that particular circle? How do you reconcile that? The other guests on the couch shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging quick glances. The comedian cleared his throat nervously. The audience had gone noticeably quieter, sensing that the conversation was taking an unexpectedly serious and potentially awkward turn. Colin's smile became more fixed, more forced, his eyes narrowing further. Graham, I think you're quite deliberately oversimplifying what I said in that interview to create a conflict. I was making a nuanced point about industry trends and the balance of content being produced, not making sweeping absolute statements about what actors should or shouldn't do with their careers. But it sounds to me, and to many people who read that interview, like you're trying to have it both ways, Graham continued, his famous wit now carrying a distinctly sharper edge that his regular viewers would immediately recognize as unusual. You're criticizing the direction of British cinema publicly while actively participating in it and, presumably, getting paid quite handsomely to do so. That's a fair observation to make, isn't it? That's worth discussing. Colin's voice took on a noticeably cooler, more clipped tone. What would be fair is to actually understand and engage with what someone is saying before you criticize it on national television in front of millions of viewers. I wasn't condemning all serious drama wholesale. I wasn't saying dark films shouldn't exist. I was making a specific observation about balance and variety in the British film industry and lamenting the loss of a certain tradition. The audience went even quieter, if that was possible. Several people in the front rows looked genuinely concerned. Graham raised his eyebrows in obvious surprise at the pushback, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. I'm not criticizing you personally, Colin. I'm simply asking you to clarify what seemed, to me, and to others, like a contradictory position. That's what we do here on this show. We have real conversations about interesting topics, not just promotional fluff. Conversations, yes, absolutely, Colin replied, his British reserve beginning to visibly crack now, his voice taking on an edge that shocked people who know his typically gentle demeanor. But this feels significantly more like an interrogation than a conversation. You're deliberately twisting my words to create some kind of gotcha moment for your audience. That's not dialogue, Graham. Graham's expression showed genuine surprise and a flash of offense. Gotcha moment? Colin, I'm literally quoting from your own published interview and asking you about it. How is that twisting your words? How is asking you to explain your own stated position twisting anything? Because you're taking one carefully considered comment out of its full context and building an entire narrative of hypocrisy around it, Colin said, his voice rising slightly in volume and intensity. You're acting as if I wrote some kind of angry manifesto condemning all of modern British cinema, when what I actually did was make one thoughtful observation in a much longer conversation about film and storytelling. The comedian, sitting directly next to Colin, tried desperately to lighten the suddenly heavy mood, forcing a nervous laugh. Well, this got intense incredibly quickly. Should I leave you two alone to work this out? Maybe get a referee in here? But neither Colin nor Graham acknowledged the attempt at humor, or even seemed to hear it. They were locked in on each other now, the tension between them palpable. Graham leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming noticeably more serious and less playful. Colin, with all due respect, and I mean this sincerely, you gave that interview to a major publication knowing full well it would be published and discussed publicly. You made those statements voluntarily and deliberately. Surely, you expected people, including other people in the industry and journalists like myself, to engage with them and ask questions? Engage with them? Yes, absolutely, Colin replied tersely, his accent becoming more pronounced as his emotions heightened. Misrepresent them and use them against me? No. There's a very significant difference between thoughtful engagement and what you're doing, and you're firmly doing the latter. Graham's voice sharpened noticeably, his famous affability evaporating. I haven't misrepresented anything at all. I have asked you straightforward questions about your own words. If you're uncomfortable with your own words being discussed and examined, perhaps you should think more carefully before you give interviews to major publications. Perhaps I shouldn't come on shows where the host is clearly more interested in creating conflict and controversy than having genuine, honest conversation, Colin shot back, his famous composure visibly cracking now, his face reddening slightly. The studio went absolutely completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The audience members looked at each other with genuinely wide, shocked eyes, mouths open. Several people gasped audibly. Graham sat up, ramrod straight, his face flushing noticeably pink. Creating conflict? Colin, you're the one getting inexplicably defensive about a straightforward, reasonable question. I've been nothing but respectful to you since you sat down. Respectful would be actually listening to what I'm actually saying instead of trying to paint me as a hypocrite for your audience's entertainment, Colin said, his voice growing even louder now, projecting across the studio. Respectful would be engaging with the actual substance of my point, instead of looking for contradictions that simply aren't there. Graham's famous friendliness was rapidly disappearing entirely, replaced by visible irritation and anger. I am engaging with the substance. The substance is that you publicly criticized an aspect of the film industry while being an active, willing participant in that very aspect. That's not me looking for contradictions. That's an inherent, obvious contradiction in your publicly stated position that deserves examination. No, it bloody well isn't. Colin's voice rose sharply, startling everyone. Several audience members actually jumped. You can be part of an industry and still have thoughtful, critical observations about its direction. You can participate in something while also wanting it to evolve and improve and maintain balance. That's not hypocrisy, Graham. That's having a functioning brain and using it to think critically. Graham's eyebrows shot up dramatically. There's absolutely no need to be condescending to me, Colin. I'm not questioning your intelligence or your right to have opinions. I'm questioning the consistency and logic of your publicly stated position. Well, perhaps if you had the intellectual capacity to understand basic nuance, you'd clearly see there's no inconsistency whatsoever, Colin replied sharply, and immediately the words hung in the air with absolutely devastating effect. Graham's face went from flushed pink to completely pale white. The audience gasped collectively. The other guests looked horrified. I beg your pardon? Are you seriously suggesting I lack intelligence? Are you insulting my intelligence on my own show? Colin seemed to realize in that moment that he'd crossed a significant line, but pride and anger prevented him from backing down. I'm suggesting you're choosing not to understand my perfectly clear point because creating controversy and conflict makes for supposedly better television than actual substantive conversation. That's what I'm suggesting. That is completely unfair and deeply insulting, Graham said, his voice tight and trembling with genuine anger now. I have built my entire career, my entire professional reputation, on having genuine, warm, entertaining conversations with guests from all walks of life. I don't ambush people. I don't create false controversy. I don't set traps. I ask honest, direct questions and let conversations flow naturally. Honest questions would take into account the full context of what I actually said, Colin replied firmly, his voice steady but intense. What you're doing is taking one quote, removing all context, and beating me over the head with it repeatedly for entertainment value. Graham's hands gestured wildly in frustration, his wineglass forgotten on the desk. I asked you literally one question about one statement you made publicly. One single question, and you've somehow turned it into this massive confrontation. You're the one escalating this, not me. Because it wasn't just a question, and you know it, Colin said, his voice rising even further. It was an accusation dressed up as a question. You accused me of being hypocritical from the very first moment you brought up the play topic. That was your framing from the start. I did absolutely no such thing. Graham's voice was genuinely loud now, too, his famous calm completely shattered, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced. I asked you to explain an apparent contradiction. That's journalism. That's basic interview practice that any competent journalist would employ. If you can't handle being asked to explain your own public statements without having a complete meltdown, then maybe you shouldn't make controversial statements in the first place. The other guests on the sofa looked absolutely mortified and paralyzed, frozen completely in place, clearly not knowing what to do or where to look or how to possibly salvage this disaster. The comedian had his hand over his mouth. The music star looked like she wanted to disappear into the sofa cushions. The audience was dead silent, collectively holding their breath, not moving. Colin stood up, abruptly, violently. The movement so sudden and explosive it startled everyone in the studio. Several people in the audience actually screamed. You know what, Graham? You're absolutely right about one thing and one thing only. I shouldn't have come on this bloody show. That was a terrible mistake. A huge error in judgment. Graham stood as well immediately, his face showing a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been panic. Colin, sit down right now. Don't be ridiculous about this. We can talk about this like adults. We can work this out. I don't want to talk about it anymore, Colin said firmly, emphatically, starting to remove his lapel microphone with visibly shaking hands. I don't want to sit here one more second and be insulted and attacked on national television by someone who clearly has significantly more interest in creating viral moments than actual meaningful dialogue. Insulted? Graham's voice was incredulous, almost hysterical. You're the one who just openly questioned my intelligence in front of everyone. You're the one who just suggested I'm incapable of understanding nuance. And now you have the audacity to claim you're the victim here? Are you serious? I'm not claiming I'm a victim of anything except your terrible interview technique, Colin replied coldly, harshly. He dropped the microphone onto the red sofa with a thud that the microphones picked up clearly. This isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I was promised. Graham's voice took on a desperate, pleading quality, clearly realizing how catastrophically bad this looked for his show and reputation. Colin, please sit down. We'll move on to a completely different topic. Let's talk about your new film coming out. Let's talk about your charity work. Let's start over completely fresh. No, Colin said flatly, definitively, with absolute finality. We're not starting over. I'm leaving right now. This was a disaster from the very first minute, and I'm not going to sit here and make it any worse than it already is. You're making it infinitely worse by walking off in a huff, Graham said, his voice rising sharply in frustration and panic. You're turning a simple disagreement, a simple difference of opinion, into a major televised incident that will be everywhere. A simple disagreement. Colin's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You ambushed me with loaded, accusatory questions and then acted offended and wounded when I dared to defend myself and my position. That's not a simple disagreement, Graham. That's a deliberate setup for controversy." "It wasn't a bloody setup," Graham shouted, his composure completely shattered now, his voice echoing through the studio. "I asked you about something you voluntarily said in a published interview. That's literally my job. That's what I do on this show every single week." "Well, you do it poorly and dishonestly," Colin said coldly, and those words seemed to hit Graham like an actual physical blow to the stomach. Graham's face went bright, red, his eyes wide. "Get off my show then. Right now. If I'm so terrible at my job, if I'm such a poor interviewer, get the hell off my show." "I'm already leaving, Graham," Colin replied, turning sharply toward the exit. "You don't need to tell me twice. I can't get out of here fast enough." "Colin, don't you dare walk off this stage," Graham called after him, his voice shaking violently with anger and something else, maybe fear. "Don't you dare make me look like the villain here when you're the one who can't handle one simple, straightforward question." Colin stopped abruptly and turned back one final time, his face set in an expression of cold fury. His voice was quiet but carried with perfect clarity across the entire silent studio. "The only villain here, Graham, is whoever convinced you that attacking your guests and creating hostile confrontations makes for good television. I came here in completely good faith. You violated that trust. You betrayed basic professional courtesy. And now I'm leaving, and I won't be back." "I didn't attack anyone," Graham shouted, his voice actually cracking with emotion now. "I asked you one question. One. That's all I did." But Colin was already walking off the stage with long, angry strides, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silent studio. He moved quickly and purposefully toward the exit, not looking back once, his face set in an expression of anger and barely contained fury and disgust. Graham stood there on his stage, in front of his desk, with his wine glass still sitting there, his face cycling rapidly through multiple emotions: shock, anger, hurt, confusion, disbelief. The other guests remained completely frozen on the red sofa, looking absolutely horrified by what they just witnessed unfold before their eyes. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every single awful second of the aftermath. The producers in the control booth were presumably panicking. The audience sat in stunned, heavy silence, nobody moving at all, nobody speaking. Some people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were clearly recording on their phones, knowing they'd just witnessed something absolutely unprecedented in the show's long history. Graham slowly, almost mechanically, sat back down in his chair behind his desk, running both hands through his hair repeatedly, his face still red. He looked at the camera, then at his remaining guests, who looked terrified, then down at his desk. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out initially. He reached for his wine glass with a shaking hand and took a long drink. The jovial, warm, comfortable atmosphere that had opened the show just minutes earlier was completely destroyed, utterly shattered, replaced by an uncomfortable, suffocating tension that seemed to fill every single corner of the studio. The red sofa, usually a place of laughter and fun stories and celebrity camaraderie, now felt like the site of a terrible disaster. Colin Firth, one of Britain's most respected, most dignified, most beloved actors, had just walked off the Graham Norton Show in the middle of taping, in front of a live studio audience. The confrontation had escalated from what seemed like a simple clarifying question to a full-blown, screaming argument in a matter of just a few minutes, all captured on camera, all witnessed by hundreds of people in the studio, and eventually millions who would watch. As the seconds ticked by in painful, excruciating silence, Graham finally managed to speak, his voice shaky and uncertain. "Well, that was completely unexpected. I honestly don't know what just happened there. I truly don't." The comedian on the sofa tried desperately to ease the unbearable tension, forcing a weak laugh. I've never seen anything remotely like that on this show before in all my years watching it. Neither have I, Graham admitted, still looking genuinely shell-shocked, his eyes wide. I genuinely, honestly, thought I was asking a fair, reasonable question. I didn't think it would lead to this. But the damage was absolutely done, irreversible and complete. Colin was gone, and the evening's taping was in complete ruins. The warm, friendly, relaxed atmosphere that the Graham Norton Show is internationally famous for had been replaced by the aftermath of an explosive confrontation that nobody in that studio saw coming or wanted. The red sofa, usually a place of laughter and fun stories, now felt like the site of a disaster. Graham took a long drink from his glass, his hand visibly trembling. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to proceed. The audience continued to sit in awkward silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. And somewhere backstage, Colin Firth was presumably leaving the building, his relationship with one of Britain's most beloved talk shows possibly destroyed forever. The show would have to go on, somehow, with the remaining guests. But everyone in that studio knew that this moment, this confrontation, would be what people remembered and talked about. Not the jokes, not the other guests, not the fun stories that might come later. Just those brutal minutes when a simple question turned into a career-defining moment of television drama that nobody wanted or expected.